Hello, students. For this short talk, I would like to explain some of the books that I read when I was an architecture student. I think this is a very opportunistic time for us because um, the coronavirus is disallowing many of you to travel and to do other things. And it may be a very good time for you to actually get ahead of your studies by reading. Now, the main message of this talk is that you cannot really learn anything if you do not read. Just listening to lectures and looking at PowerPoint slides and answering questions accordingly to the exams is not what is real learning. Real learning is when you engage with an author who has thought deeply about some things, and even though that author is no longer around, like Frank Lloyd Wright, you can still have a conversation with him or her because reading sets up a personal dialogue in your mind and form the opinions that you will have later, and that is what is called true learning. Now, as I said, many students do no longer read books, even to the point of PhD students. I found not reading any books, just journal articles. And most students just rely on PowerPoint lecture notes. That is not real learning. Real learning is only when you understand something well enough to have an opinion of yourself. And you can then use that opinion to design or to debate with others. At the moment, all you have are just bits and pieces of information. That is not enough to form an opinion. And even if you did have an opinion, it's a very weak opinion. And you can find that in the crit sessions, you always lose to the lecturer simply because your opinion is very weak, because your reading is very weak. Any good architect, you find they will have libraries of books and they do read them. Now, reading connects you with architects or thoughts of long ago authors and thinkers. And although you may have listened to some videos about Frank Lloyd Wright or even watched them and also maybe listen to some very interesting speech about him, but it's nothing to compare when you read the words that he wrote himself 140 years ago. This is because thoughts are independent of technology and science, because thought is about human values, what is wrong and what is right. This is an opinion that you form yourself uh, about values relating to society, and then about issues that are mostly eternal and universal, meaning they last very long. Now, you may be interested in Game of Thrones when you were young, but then this will disappear. Or you may like Warcraft, but then again, a new game comes along and then that also disappears. But most philosophical thoughts are long lasting. And that is why when you read something, it lasts for the rest of your life. Now, my first book was when I was in the third year. It was not required of me by the lecturer. I was just fed up with not understanding architecture. I could never get A's in my studio work. I can only get A's in my other subject. And I don't like it when I listen to crits and I don't really understand half of what the lecturers are saying and the other students. Because when they talk about symbols and spaces that relate to society, I cannot understand. The easier thing about studio design is about utilitarian things like living room or toilets. And yet again, this can also be redesigned in very different manner if you have a certain philosophy about it. And that is the thing that I was lacking, philosophy. So I stumbled one day in a bookshop at the Faculty of Architecture, this book called Master Builders, written by Peter Blake. Peter Blake is himself an architect, also a writer, and an editor of a very famous architecture magazine. He wrote three books about one about Frank Lloyd Wright, another one about Le Corbusier, and the third one is about Miss Van der Rohe. And the publisher combined all of them into one book called Master Builders. This is a great book to start with because it is a story. It's like reading a novel about real life people. And the manner in which Peter Blake brings the story is very, very engaging and very interesting. And I get involved with the characters in the story because of the manner of its writing. So when I discovered how Frank Lloyd Wright, who had never gone to architecture school, was influenced by poets talking about democracy, freedom, and the American landscape, the beauty of it, and then he began to rebel against the notion of American architecture. Le Corbusier is a great thinker about how modern life was supposed to be rather than sticking on to traditional lifestyle in traditional buildings. Corbusier analyzed city living, how you might want to be living in a very nice, harmonious manner with the environment. Corbusier, again, was not in architecture school. He was a sculptor, a painter, an artist. And funnily enough, Miss Van der Rohe also did not really go to a proper architecture school. They just had rudimentary trainings in drafting. He worked for a contractor and began to develop a sense of discipline of building. And later on, he was known to be the one that gives a very dignified language to steel architecture as well as in combination with brick. So he understood structural materials into the sense of the art of building them to the point of having beauty in itself. So construction and structure has its inherent beauty. In Le Corbusier, it is about the sculptural aspects of buildings and its arrangements that gives organization and meaning to society. With Frank Lloyd Wright, it is the landscape that brings forth the idea of eternal materials as well as the democracy and freedom of American living and also then of architecture. So I highly recommend this book. If you didn't read any book at all, you should just read this book, and that would be enough in one sense. Now, my second two books, also in my third year, was because I had to do a paper on Louis Sullivan. And so I rushed to the library and I discovered two books. One is the autobiography of an idea, and the other one was Sullivan's Kindergarten Chats. Luckily, I read the autobiography of an idea first because it is, again, like a novel. Sullivan was telling his life story, and Sullivan is an excellent writer and a thinker and a philosopher. And he wrote about his feelings about American life and politics, and he disagreed with the latching on with tradition, with the European influence, because most Americans at that time, people who came from Europe, and they brought all the classical architecture into America and started building using those language. And Sullivan said that this was wrong. This is not American architecture. These are pseudo-Roman, pseudo-Greek, pseudo-Gothic, and this is all false architecture because this is not true to the time, not true to the politics, not true to the spirit of the American people. And he also developed ornamentation because ornament at that time was very important, and he developed his own ornament system rather than copying from the European classic work. So the book was very interesting, but the Kindergarten Chats book was more difficult to read. But it's something that really made me want to read it because there were two sections to it. Number one is his philosophical dialogue with a fictitious student, and he wrote it like what some of the Greek philosophers write in terms of a student asking a teacher, and then there is this dialogue. That's why it's called kindergarten chats, where the student and the master have this conversation about life in architecture. Second part of the book is the collection of his writings, which are mainly speeches that he had given to architecture associations and other social clubs. He outlined his ideas about American architecture, the form of his new buildings, the new ornaments that he's taken up, and why he has done so. And I find it is a very valuable piece of work, because when you want to talk about things like Malaysian architecture or any nationalistic architecture, this is a very important reference for you. So this is a bit difficult if you want to start with this. As I said, this is written by Sullivan himself. Who is Sullivan? The teacher of Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright became the most famous architect in United States, but Sullivan is known to be the prophet of modern architecture in the US. The other two books that I read was about Frank Lloyd Wright, and I also had to write some other theory papers, which made me read these two work. And these two books are written by Frank Lloyd Wright himself. In the Course of Architecture is a collection of forgot 12 or 13 of his essays or articles which he wrote in the Architecture Record, which is the uh, important professional magazine. Like we have the Majalah Architect. This is Architectural Record, which is much more than our Majalah Architect, because the writings in there are very thoughtful and actually very meaningful. And Wright wrote all these essays about his principles of modern architecture in the United States, and he disagrees much with a lot of the European architects like Gropius and Mies van der Rohe, and he developed his own idea based on what historians call the art and craft movement. But Wright himself is is a self-taught man, because, as I said, he never went to school. As opposed to Sullivan, Sullivan was given a scholarship to study in Europe, but he never finished his studies because he rebelled against the studies. Frank Lloyd Wright never even went to architecture school. He went to an engineering school and then quit and went to work for a contractor, and later on learned drafting himself and then worked for uh, Louis Sullivan. And from there, his career took off. And in the book called A Testament by Frank Lloyd Wright, if you read the book, most of the chapters or the whole part of the book is talking about his ideas on American society, what he thought should be the economics, what he thought should be the way we treat environment, but more importantly, what he thought about freedom of individuality. He didn't like federalism, meaning that the government having too much control over what creative people were supposed to be able to do. And so at the last chapter, only he developed his idea of what is termed the organic architecture, which is a very original architecture. And this is the reason why he has designed 600 over buildings throughout his lifetime and is known to be the greatest architect perhaps in the world. Um, in my effort to understand how to speak and how to articulate, how to explain architecture, I read, I stumbled upon this book called Architectural Speaking in the library. And this is a wonderful book by Professor Eugene Raskin. Professor Eugene Raskin is a professor in architecture psychology. And he explained a lot of the things that I've heard, like scale, rhythm, sequence, semantics, proportion. All these, many architecture students have heard the lecturer say, but not really understand. And after reading this book, then I understood what most of these things meant. And I highly recommend this book. It's very easy to read and it's very funny book. You will laugh if you understood the jokes that Raskin makes. See, Raskin was writing for other people also to read about architecture. Because I liked the book so much, I went to the library to seek more books by Raskin, and I found this book, Architecture and People. And this is also a wonderful book because it explains not just the language of architecture, but architecture itself, from why cities are designed or planned in a certain manner, or developed or grew in history in a certain manner, and why buildings have, say, large windows, large doors, and all these are related to architecture psychology, and it made a lot of sense to me. Uh, Reading these two books, and these two books I highly recommend. And if you didn't read any other books, you should read these two books and the book Master Builders, and your education will be meaningful. In my fifth year, I took a class called Independent Study, and in this course, you are allowed to create your own project. And I proposed to read this 600-page book because I was going to have a holiday in Malaysia, and so I said that can I write a report about this very thick book, and so the lecturer said okay, and I read all 600 pages and wrote a 80-page report on the subject of modern architecture. This book actually opened up my eyes to the whole realm of historical writing, and the all the definitions of what modern architecture was in the early days, and then in this maturity period, and as well as in its late period. So this is my uh, Bible of sorts. Like, if anyone wants to do a PhD on architecture history and theory, they will have to read this book first before they speak with me. All my PhD students have to finish this book cover to cover. If not, I will not uh, take them as student. And this book had charted my career for me as a professor of architecture later on. And I also read the book Language of Postmodern Architecture because I took a class in postmodern architecture. It was a graduate class, and we were asked to read one part of the book. But because I couldn't understand much of what was said in that particular part which the lecturer asked to read, I bought the book. I looked for it in the bookstore and I bought it. And I read the whole book because I didn't understand that section. So as I said, you need to read yourself in order for you to actually come through what is called real learning. Real learning is not depending on your lecturer. Once you know a little bit of this and that, let's say you learn about alphabets A, B, C, A for apple, B for boy. Once you can read, then you are on your own. You're supposed to be on your own. You're supposed to be independent, find out yourself, and that is what university learning is. In schools, you are taught by the teachers, instructed by them. But in university, you're not supposed to be instructed by your lecturers. You are supposed to be your own person. And many times I said that you are supposed to instruct your lecturers, not the other way around. Meaning that you have an idea and then they become the supervisor or the reflector, and they're not supposed to instruct you. But what happens now is that lecturers instruct you. Why? Because you don't have any ideas, you don't have anything to say, you don't have anything to think, you don't have anything to explain or to propose. And why? Simply because you don't read. Now, my final two books that I read was out of interest, um, and also because, as I said, I sometimes when I like a certain author like Peter Blake, I would look for the book. But From Bauhaus to Our House by Tom Wolfe, I discovered it while just going through or browsing through the bookshop. In those days, we don't have internet, and so if you want to learn things, you have to go to the bookshop. Now, form follows fiasco is Peter Blake, who is supposed to be the proponent of modern architecture, attacks modern architecture, criticizes the weakness of modern architecture. Now, that's why I said when someone understands some things, they may support it very, very strongly, but they can also oppose it later on. And so that shows they have an independence of opinion. They don't depend on people to tell them what to think, what to write, what to say, what to do. And this is the crux of education. Education nowadays is just like slavery. You are instructed to do, this is where you design, this is the way you draw, and that's about it. And that is not education. So form follows fiasco is a critique of 8 points about architecture, which is called modern architecture. And it was also a very sarcastic book, and it's very interesting because of that. Now, Tom Wolfe is also a writer that uses sarcasm or being sarcastic, but he's not an architect. He's a journalist, but he could write about architecture, and he talked about how European architects influence much of American architecture. And he criticizes the work of Mies van der Rohe, Le Corbusier, Walter Gropius. When they ran away from the Nazi in Germany and came to the United States, they were given important positions in schools of architecture. People like Frank Lloyd Wright was not given anything at all by the educationists as well as the architecture profession. The architecture profession uh, treated Gropius and all these other architects from Germany like they were important teachers and masters, and that is why American architecture left the philosophy of Sullivan Stock as well as Frank Lloyd Wright, and went on to embrace what is called the steel and glass architecture that we see now, which is known as the international style, later on by Philip Johnson. So he was being very sarcastic in the sense that he says that you got this great architect like Frank Lloyd Wright, but then you ignore him, even though he's an American, um, by you being very let's call it inferior or inferiority complex against Europe, and everything from Europe in art seems to be considered good, and therefore you simply assume that. And so it's a very interesting book for me to read as a critique of architecture. Now, finally, I just like to remind again that the books that I would recommend for you at least would be the book Master Builders, the book Architecturally Speaking, and Architecture and People. That should be the least. You shouldn't graduate without reading at least this book. But if you want to be good, you should read some thoughts of architects that talks about society, environment, not just talk about technology, not just talk about green architecture, not just talk about one specific point about the building. It has to be overall. As I said, I only began to make sense about architecture in my third year. I was able to actually argue for the first time in my fourth year on my architecture instead of just presenting and keeping quiet. But then I began to have ideas and engage in conversation with my studio masters. Uh, if not, you would just listen in as a one-way process. So the books that I read helped me create an independent thinking about architecture and society. And until now, it developed my career as a professor of architecture. I have actually written many, many books, many, many architecture in Bahasa Malaysia and in English by using all those that I learned from the books that I have explained just now. If you read carefully my hundreds of writings on architecture and society, you will note many of the influence from the books that I have read. And many people who read my writings find it fresh and unique and original. Although many may be angry when I talk about and criticize mosques, but that is how you develop an independent thinking about Islamic architecture or mosque architecture or administration architecture or or university architecture. You would never have any valuable ideas for your society if you just follow PowerPoint lecture notes. Lecture notes, PowerPoints are to start with only. It is a starting point. It is not the end point. And that is the mistake or the wrong things that students understand, because they follow the PowerPoint, they answer the final exam questions and they get A, and they think that is the right way. That is not the right way. Okay. The right way is when you have an independent thinking based on some philosophical construct that you have developed from your readings and your reflection on what you have read. So you must read and use this opportunity, or perhaps even a year when we are not going to be able to travel. You can combine with some friends, buy some ebook, or there are some books already can be downloaded. You should read on your own and do not simply depend on the semester beginning and the lecturers giving out uh, assignments or courses. Believe me, once you do that, all your assignments, all your studio work becomes easier, because you then have an opinion. For this, you just have to wait whatever the lecturer says, and that is not the right way to learn. So I hope you enjoyed this little talk, and if you have any question, you can post it. I will answer them, and I hope you do find some of these books, especially the ones that I mentioned, the three. If you have to buy them, use whatever means that you want, that you have to actually purchase them and get them, because they are actually very, very good for you. Thank you.